Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am Michael Searle, president of the Overseas Press Club. We have with us tonight representatives of three big news organizations, international news organizations that are reaching out to an American audience with English language broadcasts. We'll take a brief look at some of what they're doing, and then we'll talk to them about what they hope to achieve. Our moderator tonight is Jim Laurie, an award-winning NBC and ABC correspondent with decades of experience covering conflicts around the world, starting with the Vietnam War. More recently, he's taught journalism at the University of Hong Kong and is now a consultant in Washington. Jim, thanks for organizing this event. Ford Foundation, thanks for providing the venue. Jim, take it away.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you very, very much, and thank to all of you for coming out tonight. Special thanks to the OPC, of course, the Ford Foundation for this wonderful location, and Sonia Fry. Where is Sonia? She's around here somewhere. She organized this, and she's always brilliant in organizing all of these things. So a good hand for Sonia. A bit of transparency here in terms of, and I will get to our fellow panelists in a moment, but I've been a consultant since my ABC News and NBC News days in global television, starting up news channels first in India. And I have worked for Al Jazeera in Kuala Lumpur. When I arrived in 2008, they had 135 people. And 6 months after I left, they had 35 people. So I did something wrong or something right. I'm not quite sure which. Currently, I'm a consultant to China Central Television and their efforts to build a broadcast operation in North America. In terms of NHK, I used to live in Shibuya, where is in Tokyo, the headquarters of NHK, I used to have an office in NHK at a time when ABC News was situated near NHK in Tokyo. I'm going to have a few introductory remarks, then I'm going to show some video, and then I will introduce the esteemed panel with the hope that one person might arrive before we actually get started. But I will get to that in a second. The idea actually for this seminar comes in early 2001 when Ann Cooper, is she here tonight? Ann. Anyway, she assigned her students at Columbia Journalism School to do a project on global news channels, and she called it Global Media Wars, very provocatively. And she profiled in her students did Al Jazeera, CCTV, Russia Today, France 24 in this study. So this was sort of the inspiration, I think, for tonight's event. We invited Russia Today. The Russians declined to come, but we have managed to get together a good panel who I will introduce very, very soon. The idea of global English news channels is really a relatively recent phenomenon. You have, of course, the original global news channel in CNN, which went on the air in 1985, 86 out in Asia. You have, of course, BBC World News, which began to gain momentum worldwide in the early 90s. And then you skip a period of time. NHK began to broadcast globally out of Tokyo. And then you have the Al Jazeera phenomenon, which much has been written about that, beginning in 2005 and then going on the air in 2006 globally. Having a hard time here in the States initially. We'll get to that with our panelists a bit later. And then, of course, you have this explosion of global news channels, all of which are trying to find a little bit of space in the American market and more space around the world. You have Russia Today, you have France 24, you have a range of channels around the world. The panelists that we have here tonight represent Al Jazeera, CCTV, and NHK. And before we get started, I'd like to play a little video to introduce the content that these three channels produce. We ready for the video? If we dim the lights and play the video. Cue the videotape. Oh, we don't have videotape anymore.
It's no secret there's been a whole trend in tabloid journalism in America in the last 20 years.
Al Jazeera entered this American news landscape in January 2013. In just 7 months, we launched Al Jazeera America.
It is 4 p.m. in the Eastern Time Zone, and this is the first ever news hour from Al Jazeera America.
This isn't the startup of a new channel. This is a watershed moment in media for America.
Welcome to the first edition of Consider This.
Your average viewer wants to actually understand how the healthcare law is going to help them or hurt them.
They know they can get entertainment somewhere else. They know they can tune in for extremist bickering elsewhere on their dial.
About 1,000 protesters have occupied Times Square.
People out here are struggling.
The fire jumped the highway we took earlier.
People say that we're revolutionary. Well, our revolution is just going back to doing the best of journalism.
The audience are people who want the news.
This is the place to go to watch high quality, serious journalism, period.
Three, two, one. 5 nights a week, Biz Asia America, connecting China, America, and the world in finance, trade, and investment.
Let's check in with Philippine for a look.
Live from Washington and from the studios of NASDAQ at Times Square, New York. Our reporters exploring business stories, big and small, from lobster prices in Maine to overpriced IPOs in California. On weekends, The Heat, our program of talk. Interviews.
Deng Xiaoping had made a comeback. He was more prominent in that trip.
And vigorous debate.
I pay my taxes, do you?
中美关系就是这个世界上最重要的关系。The U.S.-China relationship is the world's most important relationship.
America's Now, our unique magazine program focusing on Central and South America, produced weekly in-depth reports from veteran correspondents across the region.
Here in Cuba, it's only in the last year or so that people
Right on
have
cue.
been allowed to set up small businesses.
CCTV America.
NHK World is your gateway to Japan and the rest of Asia.
Get different perspectives on what's making news in this dynamic region.
From the latest in business to the latest in technology, explore the culture, history,
And beauty of this corner of the world. Home to more than 4 billion people.
Objective and accurate.
Curious and daring.
NHK World. Get close to the world with Japan.
So there you have a
News
night. Sorry.
From Japan, Asia, and the world, covering critical choices and crucial developments with a perspective from this part of the globe. Anchors backed by years of experience tell you what's happening now and what's likely next. Newsline, on the hour, every hour, from NHK World.
All right, you get a sampling there of the 3 networks that are represented here tonight. So let me introduce our panelists. First, on my left, we have Marcy McGinnis, veteran CBS journalist, senior vice president for news coverage at CBS, and then beginning in August, took the reins of news gathering as senior vice president at Al Jazeera America. To my right, we have Elaine Reyes, who came from NBC Washington to CCTV Washington to become one of our anchors on the operation of CCTV America. And she anchors also the weekly program on South America, known as America's Now. Then we have Jay Campbell. Jay Campbell represents NHK. He's a longtime producer, has his own company, executive, and he's been successful since 2009, correct, in the distribution of NHK across the U.S. and through also the public broadcasting system. We'll talk about that a little later. And last but not least, although he arrived last but not least, racing off from Balmer. Were you down in Balmer?
Washington.
Oh, Washington.
Yes.
Well, almost. Anyway, Porter Bib. Porter Bib is an investment banker, I think is fair to say, who specializes on media, but he also comes from a journalism background with the New York Times and Newsweek magazine, and has written a book about Ted Turner.
Indeed.
Okay. Porter, we'll get back to you in just a few moments. First, we take a very quick survey. How many in the audience have watched either Al Jazeera English, which is the global Al Jazeera channel, or Al Jazeera America, by a show of hands? Well, that's pretty good. Now, how many of you have watched CCTV News or CCTV America coming out of Washington? A much smaller group, okay. And what about NHK World? How many have watched NHK World? A little bit smaller than CCTV. Interesting. Well, you got good ratings here.
Yeah.
Boosted your ratings, but you know.
We're doing our job.
AC Nielsen will be very happy tonight, or you will be. Marcy, since you have the crowd, clearly, let's start with you. How do you identify the mission? What is the mission of Al Jazeera America? Maybe you could also draw the distinction between the American operation and the international or CTV English operation. I'm sorry, the Al Jazeera English operation.
Well, the mission of Al Jazeera America is not different from the mission of Al Jazeera English, I think. The mission of Al Jazeera America is to provide unopinionated, in-depth news on stories that are underreported, in large part, in the United States and around the world. So we are trying to inform. We are not trying to persuade. We are simply trying to inform people about things they don't know. One of our things that we talk about all the time in the meetings are, tell me something I don't know. And when you're trying to tell a heavy news consumer like me something I don't know, that's a pretty tough mission. So the reporters out in our field are constantly being pushed to give us information that the viewer doesn't know already, and give it in a way that's not opinionated.
I'll ask the same question of Elaine Reyes. What is it that CCTV News and CCTV America seek to do in terms of the mission?
Well, I think it's very similar, but we're going wider and going international. So what we're trying to do is provide a global international newscast, cover areas that are underserved, like Latin America, Africa, and show people what's happening there, how what is happening there affects the rest of the world, how Asia is connected. We're really connecting the world with the selection of our stories, because you're not going to go to too many other channels on the dial and see a live shot from North Korea when that was all happening with their missile launches. You're not going to find a live shot and see what's happening in Havana, Cuba, or the protests in Brazil. You're looking around right now and you're seeing a lot of yelling and screaming in America, and no one else cares. I mean, happened to be in Bali last week for the APEC conference.
You get all the good assignments.
But it was great. There was a lot of hype about it, and the second that President Obama dropped out, there was this pause. First of all, a lot of the Western networks pulled back. They left. Obama wasn't going, they're not going to go too, right? I mean, the whole press corps was going to stay in Washington, D.C. and cover what was happening there.
So the American media doesn't cover unless Obama's there.
I will venture to say that was probably there. It was a lot of Asian media, a lot of. There was also a lot of South American media, because you had the presidents of Peru, the presidents of Chile, and the president of Mexico there as well. But once that was all over, it was kind of like, okay, well, let's just get down to business. There was this perception that Obama is too tied up with what's happening here, and the United States influence actually in the world seemed to be going down. It was all over the Jakarta newspapers about the U.S. influence dwindling.
We'll get to more of that in a second. I just want to get Jay in here. Jay, what is the mission globally and then in America of NHK World?
Jim, I think the slogan of NHK World says it, and they did a good job when they selected it, which is your eye on Asia. They start from a perspective of looking at it from the Japanese specifically, from all of Asia, and from within Asia to understand and to present its news and its culture. And NHK has an interesting mission because they have a combination of news at the top of every hour, but then they also have much selection of programming, ranging from travel to business to technology to many more forms that go in the second part of the time. Its global mission, its American mission, I think, are one and the same, which is to provide objective reporting and news and information from the perspective that they offer and from within the continent and the understanding that they have throughout their continent. And the fact that Asia is the second and third largest economies, the two countries that represent that behind the United States, is extremely important. And I think that NHK, when they created the channel, thought about that and thought that there really was very little understanding of the Asian culture, especially from here anyway, from the United States and throughout the world as well. We have 140 countries that we distribute to. 260 million households can watch the channel. And I'll speak in a little bit about the distribution that we have here in the United States. But I think that's the core mission.
I'm going to pick up on that. It was a good cue to slide into distribution. And Porter Bib is here. And I guess my basic question is you have got all of these channels now in the 1,000 channel universe, not to mention the internet where everybody is available online. You were somewhat skeptical, as I recall, when you appeared on CCTV back in February about the Al Jazeera purchase of Current TV. I guess my basic question, can all of these channels achieve anything? Can they have any impact in this incredibly crowded North American market?
Well, that is the question. But let's start with the economic business premise. None of these networks are suffering the way all of the news networks and news media in this country are in terms of profit and loss. Al Jazeera, CCTV, to a certain extent NHK, have basically blank checks to write, to pay for what they do. And they do very, very good journalism. But the other problem that they have is they're either government or partisan controlled or perceived to be. And for lots of reasons. I did some work with Al Jazeera trying to get cable carriage 5 or 6 years ago before Your America network started. And it's appalling to me how hostile the mindset of the people who control the distribution pipelines in this country are to anything that is not red, white, and blue America. I have one other question that I'd like to throw at them, because I don't see any of these as being sustainable businesses. There are other reasons that they exist, and I wish them all success. But as a viewer and as a news junkie, I want to see what Al Jazeera can report from the Middle East, because that's really not well covered by the U.S. media. The bureaus have been decimated over the last 10 years. The networks really, unless there's some major story, don't bother on the evening news or even with Charlie Rose on CBS in the morning. The problem that I don't get from Al Jazeera is what's really going on, country by country, city by city, tribe by tribe, in one of the most critical areas that we all have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And I say the same thing about CCTV.
Well, let me get Marcy to respond to some of your comments, and also get Marcy to tell us what is the audience that your channel is going after.